Welcome to week 2 of the lecture tutorial for the subject HLT2 IEP. My name is Carol McKinstry. I'm a lecturer in the Lectorial Health School based in Bendigo. This week we're looking particularly at searching and identifying appropriate literature and evidence, and then moving into the appraising of that evidence. So what we're looking at in terms of the 5 steps of the evidence-based practice process, we're up to the acquire, and in the 5A, so last week we went through asking a research question, and then this week we're looking at acquiring and then appraising relevant literature. So our aim is for you to be effective and efficient searchers, and particularly understanding the notion that it's very important that the right research method is used to answer. And we talk about research methods, they fall into roughly 3 categories: qualitative, which is mostly words and themes, and quantitative, which is about numbers and statistics to measure, and mixed methods, which is a combination of both qualitative and quantitative. One of the resources made available to you is the LMS site for occupational therapy students, both undergraduate and higher degree research students, and that has a wealth of resources on research designs, but also critiquing tools. So when we're looking at appraising a journal article, research article, one of the first things we look at is whether or not the right research method has been used to answer that question. So there is a variety of different types of research questions, and they should be answered with the appropriate research design. So for instance, if you want to determine which is the most effective intervention to use for a particular type of condition, then the best research design for that would be systematic review. If, however, you want to understand what it's like to have that condition, perhaps a lived experience of, then qualitative study, perhaps using a phenomenological approach, would be most appropriate. So when we're looking at types of research questions, this slide here looks at the I suppose the reasons for why you might be looking at research. So anything from intervention, diagnostic, psychometric, or perhaps diagnostic or screening, or looking at the prognosis of a condition. And these are examples of questions that you might use for that. So from those sorts of questions, these are the suggested best types of research designs for those questions. So as mentioned before, randomised control trials, or perhaps systematic reviews using a number of those RCTs would be best for an intervention type question. If you're looking at diagnostic or looking at perhaps screening, the type of research looking at whether or not, say, an assessment or a screening tool is appropriate, you might use cross-sectional surveys. Whereas if you wanted to see what happened to people who had a certain condition over time, following those through, so looking at their prognosis, a cohort study. If you wanted to look at whether the impact of something caused an improvement or a deterioration, then you might look at a cohort study, or perhaps a case control study where you have control group matched, paired with the people who are actually having the condition. If you want to look at the reliability or the validity of an assessment tool to see whether it's appropriate, you might look at some psychometric measures. And as mentioned before, if you wanted to look at the lived experience, perhaps a qualitative or a mixed method using the best of both worlds, qualitative and quantitative, might be appropriate. So why does Why do we get so hung up on study design? And in well-reported research studies, it's always clearly identified what study design has been used. But it's really important to know things about the participants, so perhaps who was selected into the study, what measures were taken about them, perhaps demographics, or actual measures, outcome measures, to get a sense of where they were before the intervention perhaps, or at the screening stage, and then perhaps during the intervention or after the intervention, or at a certain time after the screening tool. We want to certainly want to know what happens to them while they're in the study, and all of these things affect how well that research study is going to answer your question, and whether the results of that study, particularly if they're reliable or dependable or credible. So we're looking at how much bias may be present. So a full, I think, and detailed description of what happened is really important, and particularly acknowledgement that the best or most appropriate study was used that's likely to have the least amount of bias for the sort of question that's being asked. It's also really important to ensure that when you're appraising the research study, that the most appropriate critiquing tool is used, and we use different critiquing tools for qualitative and quantitative. So in particularly the LMS site, in research and evidence-based practice, that there is different tools available. When we look at quantitative research, there is also what we call a hierarchy of levels of evidence, and where level 1 evidence is systematic reviews or meta-analysis. Level 2 is our randomised controlled trials, and then we go down further. Level 3, a study that doesn't have the randomisation, or maybe a cohort study, whereas level 4 is your case series or just your pre and post test that doesn't have a control group, and level 5 is I suppose the least credible, which is the based on expert opinion. And those levels of evidence, the level 1 has the least amount of bias, whereas the level 5 has perceived to be the most amount of bias. When it's really important though, however, that those levels of evidence hierarchy only equate to quantitative evidence, not qualitative evidence, and there's a difference between when we talk about levels of evidence versus quality of evidence. So levels of evidence is about the design of the study used, and the quality of evidence is more about how well the study was conducted, and that applies to both qualitative and quantitative. So when you have found an appropriate journal article, there's 3 questions you should ask. So first of all, it should be clear what the research question was and why the study was needed, and then what was the study design, and then was that study design appropriate to answer that question. And so it's really pertinent that you don't use research evidence that hasn't used the appropriate research design for that question posed. So just now in conclusion, in preparation for weeks 3, from week 2 you would have located the article that the inquiry was based on, which the article entitled Effects of Robot Assisted Therapy on Upper Limb Recovery After Stroke, which is a systematic review. So located that, obviously read the article, and now what we're going to do in week 3 is actually start appraising systematic reviews. So that will be the first systematic review that you'll appraise, and you can find the most appropriate critiquing tool that looks specifically at systematic reviews, and that's available on the LMS site, the Research and Evidence-Based Practice LMS site. And the critiquing tool is ATNF 19, so yeah, that's homework for next week.